There is a version of the American dream, and the version that exists in almost every other country too, under a different name, that goes something like this. You work hard, you save, you get to a point where you can finally buy a home. You sign the papers, you get the keys, and somewhere deep in your chest, there is this feeling. This enormous exhale of a lifetime feeling that you have arrived, that you have done the thing, that you are now, finally, building something real. And for millions of people, that feeling is followed, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later, by a quieter, more uncomfortable realization that the house they bought didn't build their wealth, it consumed it. Not because they made a terrible decision, not because the market collapsed, but because nobody sat them down before they signed anything and explained, clearly, honestly, without agenda, what homeownership actually costs, what it actually does to a financial life when the full picture is held up to the light. I'm not here to tell you not to buy a house. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. Homeownership can be a genuinely powerful financial decision. For some people, in some situations, it is absolutely the right move. But it can also be one of the most quietly destructive financial decisions a person makes. And the reason it keeps happening is that almost everything in our culture is set up to make buying feel like the obvious, responsible, only sensible choice. And the costs that make it complicated are buried in places most people never think to look. Hi, my name is Alpha, and in this video we're going to go through the full, honest picture of what buying a house actually does to your wealth. The parts that get celebrated and the parts that get left out. We're going to look at the math, the psychology, the hidden costs, and the cultural story that keeps people from questioning any of it. Because I think when you see the full picture, you make a better decision, whatever that decision ends up being. Let's start with the belief itself, the one that runs so deep most people have never consciously examined it. Buying a home is the best investment you can make. Say that sentence out loud and it sounds like bedrock. Like something your parents said, their parents said, every financial article confirmed, every real estate agent you ever met agreed with completely. And here's the thing, it contains a grain of truth. Over long enough time horizons, in many markets, real estate has appreciated in value. Some people have built significant equity in their homes. The story is not entirely false, but it is radically incomplete. And the parts that are missing are not minor footnotes. They are the difference between an investment and an expense that slowly masquerades as one. The core problem is this. We count the appreciation of a home as a return on investment without subtracting what it costs to hold that investment. And when you actually subtract the full cost of ownership, everything that left your pocket over the years you held the property, the math looks very different from the headline version. Let me show you what I mean. Let's follow a real scenario. Not a hypothetical designed to prove a point. A realistic, representative scenario based on how homeownership actually works for a large number of people. Someone buys a house for $350,000. They put 20% down, $70,000, and take out a mortgage on the remaining $280,000 at a fixed interest rate of 6.5% over 30 years. Already, before we get to anything else, the interest alone on that mortgage over 30 years is approximately $340,000, not the principal, the interest. In total, they will pay roughly $620,000 for a house that costs $350,000. That's the first number most people never calculate before they sign. Now let's add what happens after they move in. Property taxes. In most areas, these run somewhere between 1 and 2% of the home's value annually. On a $350,000 home, that's $3,500 to $7,000 every single year. Over 30 years, at a modest average of $5,000 annually, that's $150,000. Homeowners insurance. Average costs nationally run somewhere around $1,500 to $2,000 per year, varying significantly by location, home size, and coverage. Over 30 years, that's between $45,000 and $60,000. Maintenance and repairs. This is the one that catches the most people completely off guard. The widely cited rule of thumb in personal finance is that homeowners should budget between 1 and 2% of their home's value per year for maintenance and repairs. On a $350,000 home, that's between $3,500 and $7,000 annually. Hot water heater, roof, hack system, plumbing, foundation, appliances, driveway, windows, paint, gutters. These things don't ask permission before they need attention, and they don't space themselves conveniently. Over 30 years, maintenance alone could cost anywhere from $105,000 to $210,000. And if the home appreciates, as we expect it to, the percentage-based maintenance costs rise with it. Then there are the transaction costs on both ends. When you buy, you pay closing costs, typically 2 to 5% of the purchase price. On a $350,000 purchase, that's $7,000 to $17,500, gone before you've spent a single night in the house. When you sell, real estate commissions, even in an era of changing commission structures, have traditionally run around 5 to 6% of the sale price. On a home that has appreciated to, say, $600,000 over 30 years, that's $30,000 to $36,000 leaving your hands at the moment you thought you were cashing out. Let's add all of this up. Mortgage interest, $340,000. Property taxes, $150,000. Insurance, $50,000. Maintenance, $150,000. Transaction costs on both ends, roughly $50,000 conservatively. Total cost of ownership over 30 years, beyond the original down payment, approximately $740,000. And the home, which was purchased for $350,000, has appreciated to, let's be generous and use historical average appreciation rates for residential real estate, somewhere between $550,000 and $650,000. The math is sobering. In many realistic scenarios, the total money spent on owning the home exceeds what the home is eventually worth. You are not building wealth through the asset. You are, at best, building equity slowly while spending an enormous amount on the privilege of ownership. Now, before I go further, I need to say something important, because some of you are thinking about the rent you would have paid instead, and you're right to think about it. If you don't buy, you rent, and rent is money that leaves your hands every month without building any equity whatsoever. That is a real cost. It deserves to be in the calculation. But here's where it gets more nuanced than the "rent is throwing money away" narrative allows for. The difference between your monthly mortgage payment and what you would pay in rent is not wasted. If that difference, and sometimes renting is actually cheaper than owning in the same neighborhood, is invested consistently in a diversified index fund over the same 30 years, the outcome can be startling. A landmark study by economists comparing the long-term wealth outcomes of renting and investing versus buying, done across multiple housing markets over multiple decades, found that in many markets, the renter who consistently invested the difference between their rent and what their mortgage would have been ended up with comparable or greater wealth than the homeowner. Not always, not everywhere, but far more often than the cultural narrative would ever suggest. This doesn't mean renting is always better. It means the comparison is far more complicated than anyone making money from your home purchase wants you to understand. Now let me talk about the psychological dimension of this, because I think it might be the most important piece. There's a concept in behavioral economics called the endowment effect, the tendency to overvalue things simply because we own them. The moment a house becomes yours, it becomes emotionally difficult to evaluate objectively. You stop seeing it as a financial instrument and start seeing it as home, as identity, as proof of something. And that emotional attachment, which is completely human and completely understandable, makes it almost impossible to make clear-eyed financial decisions about it. People stay in houses that no longer serve them financially because moving feels like loss. They overinvest in renovations that don't increase the value proportionally to their cost, because the house feels like an extension of themselves. They take out home equity loans to fund consumption because the equity feels like savings they've earned and deserve to access. Each of these behaviors, driven by the psychological weight of homeownership, can quietly erode the financial position that the ownership was supposed to build. There is also the illiquidity problem. A house is not a liquid asset. When the stock market is down, you don't have to sell. You can hold, wait, let it recover. But life doesn't always wait. A job loss, a divorce, a medical crisis, a need to move for an opportunity, any of these can force a sale at the wrong time, in the wrong market, with significant transaction costs on top of whatever the market is doing. Illiquid assets held with high leverage, which is what a mortgaged home is, carry risks that rarely get named when people are standing in an open house feeling the excitement of a potential purchase. And then there is the concentration problem. For most middle-class families, the home is not just one part of their financial portfolio, it is the vast majority of it. All the financial eggs in one geographic, one asset class basket. This is the opposite of the diversification that every sound investment principle recommends. When that one asset performs well, things look great. When it doesn't, when the local economy shifts, when the neighborhood changes, when the market corrects in ways that are local rather than national, there is nothing else to cushion it. So here is where the thinking needs to shift. Stop asking, should I buy a house, as if it's a yes or no question with a universal right answer. And start asking a set of more specific questions that actually match your situation. How long am I going to stay? This matters enormously. The transaction costs of buying and selling a home are significant enough that most financial analyses suggest you need to stay in a home for at least 5 to 7 years for buying to make more financial sense than renting in most markets. If there's meaningful uncertainty about where you'll be in 3 years, career-wise, relationship-wise, city-wise, that uncertainty has a real financial cost attached to it that almost never gets factored in. What is the price-to-rent ratio in my market? This is a number you can calculate. Take the purchase price of a home and divide it by the annual rent you'd pay for a comparable property. If the ratio is below 15, buying tends to make more financial sense. Between 15 and 20, it's a closer call that depends on personal factors. Above 20, renting and investing the difference tends to produce better financial outcomes over time. In many major cities right now, this ratio is well above 20, sometimes well above 30. That doesn't mean don't buy. It means understanding what you're choosing. Am I thinking of this as an investment or as a home? These are not the same thing, and conflating them is where much of the financial trouble begins. A home can be a wonderful, stable, meaningful place to build a life, but treating it as an investment strategy, as the primary vehicle through which you build long-term wealth, puts an enormous amount of weight on a single, illiquid, expensive-to-maintain asset. If you buy because you want the stability, the roots, the freedom to paint the walls and plant a garden and stay, that's a completely legitimate reason. Just don't confuse it with a financial optimization. What is the true total cost, and can my financial life actually absorb it, not the mortgage payment? The total cost, maintenance, taxes, insurance, opportunity cost of the down payment. Does buying at this price, in this moment, leave you enough financial flexibility to weather job changes, emergencies, life? Or does it stretch you so thin that a single unexpected expense puts you in a deeply precarious position? These questions do not have easy answers, but they are the right questions, and asking them, rather than simply following the cultural gravity toward ownership, is the difference between a deliberate financial decision and an emotional one with a mortgage attached. Let me bring this into something you can actually use. If you are considering buying a home in the next year or two, the single most valuable thing you can do before you look at a single listing is to build the full cost model, not just the mortgage calculator on the bank's website. The real number, principal, interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance estimate, transaction costs. Put it in a spreadsheet if you need to. Make the invisible costs visible before they become your reality. Then calculate the price-to-rent ratio for your specific market. Compare comparable properties in the neighborhoods you're considering. If you can rent a comparable property for significantly less than the true monthly cost of owning and then invest the difference consistently, run that scenario out over 10 or 15 years. See what the numbers actually say before the narrative of ownership makes the decision for you. If you are already a homeowner and the math is making you uncomfortable, take a breath. This is not about regret. Regret is not useful here. What is useful is a clearer view of what the asset is and isn't doing for your overall financial position. Does it make sense to build equity aggressively and pay it off early? Does it make sense to refinance if rates have shifted favorably? Is the home still the right size and location for your life, or are you holding it out of inertia and emotional attachment to a place that no longer fits? These are not questions with universal answers. They're questions that deserve honest attention rather than avoidance. And if you are renting right now and feeling the cultural pressure that tells you you're behind, that you should be buying, that you're throwing money away, give yourself permission to interrogate that pressure. Renting can be a financially sophisticated choice, depending on your market, your timeline, your mobility, and what you do with the difference. The goal is wealth and stability, not the appearance of it. The home can absolutely be part of that. It just shouldn't be the whole story. I want to say something before we finish, because I think this topic carries a weight that goes beyond the numbers. For a lot of people, the house is not just a financial decision. It's bound up with identity, with what it means to be a responsible adult, a good parent, a successful person, with what their own parents sacrificed to give them, with the neighborhood they grew up in, the kitchen table where everything important happened, the backyard that represents something about safety and permanence that no investment account can replicate. I am not dismissing any of that. Those things are real. They matter. The emotional reasons for owning a home are legitimate. But emotional reasons and financial reasons are different. And for too long, the financial services and real estate industries, with enormous commercial incentive to do so, have allowed those two things to blur together in a way that has cost a lot of people a lot of money. The most powerful thing you can do with this information is simply to see them separately. To let yourself want what you want, the roots, the permanence, the space that's fully yours, and also to evaluate the financial reality of the decision with clear eyes, without the cultural story doing all the work. Because when you know the full picture, when you've done the real math and asked the right questions and made the decision with your eyes open, whatever you choose is yours. It's not something that happened to you while you were swept along by momentum. It's a deliberate choice. And deliberate choices, even imperfect ones, are the foundation of a financial life you can actually navigate. Buy the house if it makes sense, financially, personally, practically, and know exactly what you're buying when you do. That clarity is worth more than any advice anyone could hand you. And if this video helped you think more clearly about one of the biggest financial decisions you'll ever face, if it gave you better questions to ask before you sign anything, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Alpha Invest. It genuinely helps more people find their way to honest, clear financial conversations like this one. And that is exactly why we keep making them.